You're listening to Contesting Wrestling Minisode number Ben told me before we started, and
33,
34,
34, Evan.
or 35, even possibly, reflecting on
numbers
episode.
Are meaningless.
Look, numbers are meaningless. Look, we're recording this on June 10th.
Guys, let's just get into it.
There's a revolution in the streets. We haven't.
Wait, here's one reason. Oh, yeah. Well, yes, that's what actually matters.
Yes.
But here's another thing that matters much less, but also matters a little bit to me. And hopefully to you guys too. So I mentioned last week our minisode was the 100th installment, or you mentioned it, Evan, was the 100th installment of this podcast, considering regular episodes, premium episodes, and minisodes. And I asked if any of our listeners had actually listened to all 100 installments.
Nah.
My dear friend Zach, who I've mentioned is the guy who got me into indie wrestling in the early 2000s, or at least introduced me to what was going on, up in Malone, New York. Zach texted me to let me know that he has, in fact, listened to all 100 installments.
Damn.
So,
Thank you,
Zach. That's amazing. Yes. The second we have merch of any kind, you will be.
I'm already going to send him a bunch of stickers.
Yeah, send him a bunch of stickers. That's cool.
You know, there's been a couple times where people who are listening their way through the episodes will message me something, and I will have completely forgotten what the joke is or anything like that. Our good friend Jeannie sent me a message the other week. She was like, "Squash or fruit?" And I was like, yeah. She's like, tomatoes are also fruit. I was like, what's happening right now? Yes, I'm aware. What's going on? And then she was
Why haven't we had Jeannie on the podcast?
And then we should. We absolutely should. And then, but yeah, she was just like, oh, you brought it up in this episode where you had a whole discussion about it. And I was like, oh, that left my brain the second I hit save changes on Transistor. Same, my father, too. My father texted me something, and I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? Are you having a stroke? And he's like, no, you said that in episode 9. I'm like, I don't even remember who I was at episode 9.
Well, that's the joy of putting out a lot of material.
I don't remember much of anything anymore. Everything's a blur.
Everything kind of melds together. I
do want to say up top, I will reiterate this at the end, but please check the show notes. None of us are, we all want to talk about what's going on, but none of us are experts of any kind. So what I'm going to say is just while people are in the streets and while the uprising is happening, everything we put out, I'm going to fill the show notes with links to resources where you can hear people who know a lot more about this stuff talk about it, and places where you can send your money if you have it. And I mean, we all personally have our feelings in which we want to, defund and abolish the police and completely reimagine law enforcement in America, in a world in which we are not immiserating historically marginalized communities like we've been doing for centuries. But there's a lot of people who you should read, like Angela Davis and shit. You should read what she says more than we do. Sorry, Katie, go.
And just to add on to that, Black Lives Matter, and if your response to that is "but," then you should immediately take off your headphones, go into your bathroom, and what's that word for when the bully flushes someone's head in the toilet?
Swirly.
Give yourself a swirly repeatedly.
Right. An auto swirly.
Repeatedly.
Then come back and read it again without responding.
Because it's not an argument.
We are ourselves trying to balance using our relatively small platform to be informative and share information while also still providing a distraction, because it is also important every once in a while to shut your brain off while things are happening so you can sort of recharge yourself with revolutionary energy.
We do also acknowledge our neon whiteness.
Extremely. Yes, absolutely. Which is a big part of why we're like, here's links to people who you should listen to who have lived this experience far more than we have.
The phrase, "these people know better," is a phrase that should be said more in American society.
I think since last week, all of us have been present at the demonstrations, or at least gone past them.
Me and Doc went to one Sunday. We're probably going to another this Sunday. I am debating. I think I'm out sitting out the next episode. There might be something Monday that I might go to.
I was just going to say, being at the demonstration on Sunday myself, it was, a very positive experience. It was completely nonviolent. And alongside the demonstration itself were people gathering in Washington Square Park again for the first time in many months now, which was also had a beautiful spirit, and I thought was a good compliment to the protest by saying, like, offering an image of what the protesters would like the world to be more like. One where we're all able to enjoy ourselves and feel free to express ourselves, whatever color we are, whatever nationality or whatever else, and have fun in public without having to be afraid of the police. I think in general, the police, whoever it is that's supposed to keep peace in our society, should not be someone who we view as an enemy, but the way they conduct themselves and the way police departments are trained and comport themselves in communities turns them into
They're
enemies.
militarized. Why does a suburban cop need tear gas and riot gear?
On a basic level, I feel like it's something that is really hard for people to remember. And especially when people feel a need to sort of divide the protesters up into the good ones and the bad ones. Like, I also, like, the demonstrations I have been to have been 100% peaceful and respectful, and everybody's, like, masked up, and it's been a really positive experience. But I think that, we all have a point at which, if we were pushed to that point, we would burn down a police station. Right? It might take multiple generations of trauma. It might take all this awful stuff. So just when you do see reports about, like, when people do take it to that level, first, just know that the whole outside agitator story is a trope that has been showing up in reports on these kinds of riots going back more than 100 years. It's almost always bullshit. Yes, there are always some stragglers that maybe have a different agenda at the protest than most people there, but for the most part, when people commit property damage, oftentimes they are doing it because it is a viable expression of protest, because you should look at it, and instead of asking yourself, oh my God, how could that person justify going and doing property damage, you should ask yourself, oh my God, what has happened to push that person who I'm going to trust is a reasonable person like myself? What has happened to push that person to be somebody who burns down a police station?
When you think, what pushed that person to go do property damage, you should be thinking, why did police shoot Breonna Taylor 8 times when she was asleep in her bed? That's what you should be thinking.
And imagine if you knew her, what that would do to you and where that would push you. And then, with that empathy, you can try to understand, why stuff is happening. And also, if you don't have that problem, if you do have this empathy and you understand, you feel like you see what's going on, you should really try to talk to your friends and family who don't get it. And
I've stopped trying. They're unredeemable.
Well, we all have, like, we all know people who are just whatever. They're on the Trump train. You're not really going to be able to do anything about it.
But since we're letting it all out in this mini, I can consider anyone who's still a Trump supporter and still doubling down part of a cult.
Sure, and that's
I'm saying it. I'm not taking it back.
You should not waste your energy dashing yourself upon those rocks. But we all know people who were maybe somewhere teetering on the, like, especially, you might have a lot of people who are sort of like, oh, I think they're justified, but I don't understand why they have to be angry about it. You have to try. You got to give it a couple shots to talk to people, at least. There's a point at which you should stop, but, like, we do have a responsibility, especially if you're as lily white as we are, to talk to the lily white people in your life about this kind of shit.
Yeah, well, that's an important point. Like, I'm white, I'm male, I'm like, it's not like some grand personal emotional labor for hundreds of years of oppression for me to just debate with somebody the way it might be for somebody without my demographics. And that doesn't mean I'm going to argue with everybody. That doesn't mean I'm going to argue with any one person forever. But better me argue with somebody than, somebody that it might really hurt them to try and argue with you about it. So I try when I feel comfortable doing so and when I feel like it, which is a decent percentage of the time. You got to pick your shots, going on to random news, posts on Facebook and arguing with strangers. It can be fun if you're into that, but you're not going to change any minds. You change more minds talking to people who otherwise trust you with things, speaking to them in private, than you ever will in the performative nature of social media.
And hear me out, everybody, because I think this is important to reiterate, and I've reiterated on my Twitter, @RefKatie, a few times. When you're scrolling through Twitter comments on a large political post and you see someone say something stupid and ignorant and first of all, look at their account. How many numbers are in their name? How many actual posts have they made? Is it all retweets? How old is their account? How many followers do they have as opposed to how many people they're following? Don't argue with robots, for the love of God. Do not waste your energy arguing with someone that is not real.
The only people who you have any chance of making an impact on are people that you know in your personal life. Like that really is. I mean, I get like maybe you can go canvassing or some shit, but I think for the most part it's people in your life that you will.
Well, specifically, what I mean is the Twitter bots are out in full force right now. Oh, like actual robots.
Oh yeah, you can find the same comment being made by hundreds of different accounts with a dozen or 24 followers each that were all created within the last month. This kind of thing happens all the time. Like, to bring it kind of back to the topic of our podcast, like, Evan, could you imagine trying to be introduced to wrestling in this fashion by a bunch of people you don't know or care about? Like, this whole podcast is you giving us the benefit of the doubt because we have said things to you before that made sense otherwise.
That's actually that's a strong thing. This was based on, I knew there was a disconnect. There's something there, actually. Yeah, very much so.
So that's the importance of it. It feels good for some people to go off a lot on social media. And I'm not saying don't go off on social media. But social media is not, meat space. The people directly around you can be affected. The people in far-flung pieces of the world, unless you have a really big megaphone, probably aren't going to do. But
also, this podcast is only made possible by the fact that, Evan, you were interested in learning from us about wrestling. You wanted to fill that gap.
Yes. You approached Doc and Ben and you were like, "Hey, would you like to torture me for everyone else's entertainment?"
Essentially,
most people don't want to be exposed to the opposing political view, right?
No.
Well, I think one of the things that makes this movement different from the last bunch of times this has happened is even the people I know that are pretty right-wing were like, well, I mean, that was still murder. I saw the video. Whereas the denial of it being murder when a cop kills a black person always comes in full force from that side. So that's murder. Wait, there's all this other stuff that comes with it, creates an opening. It creates an opportunity to at least try and bring our minds together a little closer so maybe we don't have to have a full-on civil war.
Yeah, this is something that I talk about in my philosophy classes. Like, if you just have a contradictory viewpoint to someone else, there's nothing you can really do. You can't really get past that. Unless you have an argument. You have presented reasons for your viewpoint, and they've presented reasons for theirs. Because if it turns out that you actually agree about the reasons, like you agree about some of the premises of the argument, and the argument is well structured, then the other person, if they accept your premises, might see that by implication, they should accept the conclusion as well. But if you've just presented the conclusion without any of those premises, without the argument leading up to it, there's nothing to talk about.
And just saying on social media, well, if somebody starts to disagree with you on X, Y, or Z, just completely shut them down and cut them out. It's presuming the second part of that point, which is clearly not true.
But also on what you were saying before, Doc, if you do that, it could turn out like this very clear empirical piece of evidence of the video of George Floyd being murdered. There might be something that is just an undeniable premise. And if you have an undeniable premise, then you can start to show people what's implied by that premise.
Well, and I also think something that this has been revealing is that, oh God, I'm trying to remember. I saw somebody on Twitter making the point that this is going to soon make police defunding and at the very least demilitarization. It will stop being a political thing and just start being a practical thing soon, because so many like public officials and people in power who have been like signing off on these insane police department budgets for years are finally starting to realize, oh, I guess having a private military with its own agenda that's answerable to no one in every city in America was maybe a bad idea.
Maybe we shouldn't have given the cops all of those leftover military weapons.
Maybe that's going to be bad for me. Which is the only way
you studied world history, military coups, small and large, happen all the time. And it can start with giving an army in your city autonomy.
To bring this back to wrestling in a different way, one thing that's really strange right now is the kind of propaganda war that's going on, or like the Democratic Party, and particularly like the mayor of New York, trying really hard to make it look like he's standing with the protesters while at the same time, clearly fighting against them. Like, you walk down the street and those internet stations that we have on the corner,
yeah,
they're flashing like the names of all the victims of the police, and doing a whole Black Lives Matter thing.
Yeah.
And it's like,
I believe somebody bought that as ad space.
Oh, someone bought it as ad space. Okay.
Yeah. That's the
You
idea.
can do that.
But even that, even that is, I don't know.
Well, it's like the street painting. It's like people were painting the words Black Lives Matter on the street, and it's just like, can you do an actual thing?
Right. There's so many empty virtue signaling gestures.
Can you do an actual thing that fucking helps them?
Donate whatever $10 you can find,
Take whatever amount of money you spent painting it on the goddamn street and I fucking give it to somebody. Like, that's what makes me nuts. And that's part of why man, I've lived in New York City. We've all the majority of us have lived in New York City our whole lives or much of our lives, and I've never seen New Yorkers so united in hatred.
Because fuck the NYPD.
Against well no, by the NYPD, but it's specific, but de Blasio. Like, even the people who love the cops hate de Blasio now. It's remarkable.
But I was going to say, it reminds me of, Triple H and Stephanie McMahon trying to make it look like they're the reason for the women's revolution.
Right. Not all these great women's wrestlers that finally are given it. It's like, okay, well, they helped to give them a platform, but they didn't do most of the work.
And they were the reason why it was in such bad shape beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, Vince was. Vince was the ones that only wanted to hire tens.
And then Triple H and Stephanie had several daughters.
Yup.
Alrighty.
I actually had some things about wrestling I wanted to say, but I don't know.
Pick two.
All right, two. Well, number one, since we were talking about Io Shirai in the episode that we're reflecting on, because she was in the Black Lotus triad, she is now the NXT Women's Champion.
Hell yeah,
so now, arguably, the top 3 women's championships in the U.S., the Raw Women's title, the NXT Women's title, and the AEW Women's title, are all held by Joshi.
Good.
Almost none of the champions in the WWE now are white. The 2 top male champions are. Am I missing anyone?
All around, including NXT?
Yeah.
Well, Adam Cole's still champion in NXT.
Adam Cole's still the champion. But they have a lot of non-white champions, and that's good to see.
Yeah.
Now, I will say they should probably give those top belts more to non-white people, but we've seen progress, and I'll give them a progress nod on that.
Okay, two more things. There's one that I think I really want to talk about, but I'm gonna save it because it's a big one. But it's something I've been thinking about for a while. But I'm gonna have a little argument potentially with Doc and Katie about something coming out, specifically Doc. Otherwise, I wanted to say about Rey Mysterio, because we were talking a bit about how, he's just undeniably entertaining and great. And I just wanted to mention our unfortunately late friend, Ned Vizzini, who is a great writer. Some of our listeners may have even read some of his stuff. He didn't like wrestling at all, but whenever he came over and wrestling was on, if it was Rey Mysterio on the screen, he was fucking hyped.
Rey Mysterio, I do think, and this is why there's going to be a Rey Mysterio episode very soon, is because I cannot think of another wrestler. Like, he's not the most famous, he's not necessarily the most well-known or anything, but I can't think of anybody who you could just show fucking anybody a Rey Mysterio match. Anybody with any level of feeling about wrestling, from bitter hatred to complete indifference to have never having heard of it to a long time, just anybody could watch it and be like, oh, this is great. He's the most obviously talented wrestler who's ever lived, I think.
There's a reason Eddie Ray is the go-to to show people that aren't really into wrestling. Even after 23 years, or 22 years, it is the go-to.
And the very last thing I wanted to talk about, and we might have a longer discussion about this eventually, because Jordan was telling us about, and one thing I just really want to point out about this episode we did with Jordan as a guest, I think his perspective on wrestling is as different from ours as anybody we've had on the show so far.
Yes,
Sure.
Agreed.
And that I found really fascinating. He's only been watching for a few years. He's coming to it from a completely different angle than anybody else. And part of that angle is what I wanted to talk about, how he got into wrestling through the drag scene. And he was talking about drag as this thing, that requires multiple different talents. All at once, being displayed all at once, and how he saw wrestling as somewhat similar. And I just wanted to point out, to me, especially being like a reader of Friedrich Nietzsche and stuff like that, and this might resonate for you a little bit, Evan, given your studying of classical music, Richard Wagner, who, turned out to be a Nazi and all that, and fuck him. But
Proto-Nazi, to be specific. That's not me. That's not me defending
right,
him. Let's just in the name of being technically correct. Yeah.
Chronologically
Yes.
correct. Yeah.
The more you study history, the more you babble on and on about specifics that were, in fact, extremely important at the time. And, if you study history, they are still important.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on.
But anyway, Wagner attempted to create the total art with his opera. And he had a whole new type of stagecraft developed for his operas. And to me, wrestling, at least ideally, what it could be, is that fucking total art. And I think that's the way that Jordan sees drag.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I see it.
and that's how
Yeah, I dig
wrestling
it.
resonated
The
for him.
the most resonant comparison for me personally that you guys have made about wrestling has been the Dark Souls games, and specifically the way that you kind of have to drag yourself through a whole lot of shit in which you learn like what you like and what you don't like, and then the highs are so amazing and rewarding. And I would argue that video games are, when executed well, are sort of the most complete art we have developed thus far, in that they encapsulate the most the widest array of storytelling techniques and in an immersive simulation,
The more immersive they get, the more so that's going to be, right? Like when we have
100%.
full on VR, like you can't get more total than that.
But yeah, and like I could go on. Well, I'll save it for another episode. I'll save it for a video game episode.
Maybe when we have Sean on.
Yes, yeah,
Cool.
totally.
Yeah, if we could do that, that would be cool.
Alrighty. Do you have a last thing, or was that it? Were those all the things? Okay.
I think we're
Listen-
ready.
Defund the NYPD.
Yes, listeners, we love you. Check the show notes for links, resources to educate yourself and others, places where you can send money or donate your time and effort. I don't know, call scripts and shit. Yeah, if you live in New York, my God, harass your local officials. Jesus, that's a tradition in this city. Is call up your city council person and be be really nice to the person who picks up the phone, but leave them a message that is the message of an absolute dick.
All of that vitriol that you that you have the urge to spew on Twitter, direct it towards those
Yes,
representatives.
exactly.
Use that rage and do something.
They have more than 15 followers. And are in fact actual people. Yeah, the local government in general is a very important part of all this that we have to change. We got to change the link between city council members and judges and DAs and the cops altogether. That's not really something within my area of expertise, but I know it's something we have to deal with, and I'm not going to go too far on about it because we've already gone half.
One thing I know for a fact you can do off the top of my head is go to Verso Books, their website VERSO. And they have you can download an ebook of The End of Policing by Alex Vitale, which is just a great primer / introduction to what police abolition looks like. So that's a great thing. Now check the show notes for other things. We love you, contesting wrestling listeners. Have a great
We
day.
love each and every
Yes.
one of you.
Take care of yourselves out there. Goodbye.
Peace.
Bye.
Peace.